Welcome to Shop Talk, everyone. I'm Brandi.
And I'm James, and we talk about all things related to cross-cultural workers and mental health.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 4.
Well, we are excited today to have Verne Salter, who has spent over 30 years as a vocational Christian worker, both stateside and overseas. Having received help in time of crisis, he values the below-the-waterline work of counseling, as well as at-the-waterline work of adopting soul care practices, relational reconciliation, and healthy rhythms in vocational ministry. He has an MA in clinical counseling from Colorado Christian University. He blends pastoral and professional care through his perspective on providing care to cross-cultural workers. He's trained in EMDR, Gottman marriage therapy, and soul care, and brings a broad scope to member care. He is married to Janelle, has 3 adult children, 1 beautiful grandbaby, and lives in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And he is the director of care and special projects for MTI, among many of the other things he does, both as a counselor and evaluator and care provider for cross-cultural workers. So welcome, Vern.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Brandi. Good to be here with you.
Great to have you. And we're going to be talking about a really light topic today. No big deal. Addictions. But I'm glad we're going to be talking about this because I imagine as we get into this, there's a lot more to it, and probably a lot more cross-cultural workers have dealt with something in the area of addictions, or they know someone who has. And so I'm glad to be talking about it with you.
Good to be here.
I definitely want to, as we talk, look at those 2 different parts, both the how do we respond to an individual struggling with addiction, but also what is it like to be a family member far away and trying to navigate some of those consequences of having addiction in the family and trying to do the supportive things for other family supporting or also for the individual that's struggling.
That's good. That's good.
I was talking to a friend of mine last night. And I said, well, I'm going to do a podcast about addictions and cross-cultural workers. So it's like, hey, what kind of questions would you be interested in? And she's like, well, I think she was surprised at first that cross-cultural workers would even deal with and struggle with addictions. And I was like, oh, yeah. So I wonder if you run into that whenever you talk to people outside of cross-cultural work, and mention these things, if they would be surprised at all that, this is a part of life.
Yeah, I think they definitely are. And, that startling realization for many of them has been when I say to them, I'm an alcoholic. And so, there aren't many of us that have become alcoholics on the mission field because we refuse to care for ourselves effectively, but I'm one of them. And so I do have people that are surprised that's the case. Yeah.
What aspects of cross-cultural work might make us at a higher risk of dealing with addictions or things like that?
Yeah, well, so there are certain personality types that are more prone to addictive behavior, right? So, and those personality types are also prone to kind of very external view of the world and kind of stuffing their stuff or putting on a mask. I'm fine. So we get up on stage, we do our ministry work, and we don't deal with the internal piece. And so those things tend to get magnified in a cross-cultural setting. And that's probably one of the bigger adjectives I would use for what you're asking, Brandi, is that what most of us deal with in normal life in our home culture, when we go overseas, becomes magnified. So isolation, lack of friendship becomes a much bigger issue when I move cross-culturally. And as well as maybe some of the ways that I look at how I live my life, the rhythm of my life, the things that anchor me in healthy ways that help me to be grounded, to be authentically who I am. Those things can get violated in a cross-cultural context. It's not just short-term, but long-term. And so if I don't do the work, if I do have one of those personality types, and I don't learn how to do that work, then it can become a crisis. It can become systemically problematic, something I struggle with, periodically throughout my cross-cultural experience. So it can show up in a variety of ways. There was a wonderful article that came out a number of years ago called "To Hell on a Cream Puff." And it specifically was a cross-cultural worker talking about her food addiction in the context of being overseas. And you go, yeah, that's, so we talk about like what things do people get addicted to? Maybe the most common would be food. And food addiction shows up in a variety of ways, but it's an abuse of something that God gives us that we need to meet internal needs it wasn't meant to meet. And so in that sense, it falls into the level of an addiction.
I want to just kind of take a slightly bigger picture view as we get into this. The American Society of Addictive Medicine defines addiction as a primary chronic disease of the brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to a characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. And all of those words to essentially say what you were talking about, we're trying to meet a need in an unhealthy way. And sometimes that's with a particular substance, whether it's a behavior or a stimulant or a chemical that on its own isn't necessarily creating an addiction. So caffeine is addictive, nicotine is addictive, food can be addictive, and sexuality in a lot of different forms can be addictive. So when we kind of approach all these things, what it is it's something that's we're trying to meet an emotional need through an unhealthy way. Yeah. And then we develop neurological wiring of those repeated uses that get stronger and stronger and stronger. And then you start having things like you build up tolerance and it's really, really hard to stop. So you have withdrawal symptoms and it's often happening at great cost. And these are all the DSM diagnosis things.
I appreciate what you said, Vern, about, there's going to be certain personality types that are more prone to addiction, but when you're in your home context, in a place where you feel more comfortable, you might be able to deal with it or have different supports. Whereas when you're on the field as a cross-cultural worker, it is a pressure cooker. And so whatever you're dealing with is magnified. And I wonder if it's a shock to some people that, these things are all of a sudden so intense and they don't have their normal coping strategies there. So they're kind of on their back foot trying to figure out what do I do now? And how do I deal with these really strong emotions and experiences?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And so you realize that, what you just read, James, and how that, kind of defines what the problem is for me as an individual, gets expanded into my bigger system. And so I go overseas and all of a sudden I'm experiencing different kinds of stress I haven't contextualized. What does this mean? And I'm trying to figure out how to live with that. And there's this heightened resource usage and I'm not sure, where do I get the resources? How do I address this in healthy ways? What am I supposed to do in this new context? And and so that can result in some pretty unhealthy strategies.
I don't know, this is a good metaphor. I just had this image of when somebody's driving a manual transmission car, especially for the first time, they're revving it so much more, because they're afraid I might kill it, I might stall it. So you go overseas and all of a sudden you're revving your engine a whole lot more. It's the hills are a lot steeper, the amount of traffic, the people, all of that stimulus into our brains and our bodies, increasing stress, causing things that can lead up to like burnout and depression and other things we've talked about on the podcast. And it's just consuming a lot more fuel. So all of a sudden we're like, wow, what am I going to do to feed my system? So if you show up already depleted or perhaps without really good coping strategies, then you might be looking in a kind of a desperate way for trying to relax or get those needs met or take the edge off. Or what are some of the, you mentioned food and you've mentioned alcohol. What are some of the other types of addiction you've seen in cross-cultural workers or addictive tendencies?
Certainly what we've seen statistically speaking from candidates going to mission agencies is a massive increase in pornography usage and unhealthy sexual practices. Yes, exactly. And so, it could be in the last 25 to 30 years, it could be as much as a 60% jump.
Wow.
For missionary candidates. So it could have, statistically, anywhere from about 25 to 30%, some having some struggle, to 90% of men who are candidating with agencies. And so a lot of agencies have had to very quickly shift gears and say, how do we address this? How do we allow for some formative experience, starting with the candidating process and going on into their first assignment as cross-cultural workers? Because if we say to all of these folks, no, you're, if you're currently a sexual struggler, then you can't serve overseas. One, I would have a problem with that biblically, but two, you're going to send most people home.
Yeah, I mean, just right off the top, I think it was huge. Josh McDowell talked about meeting with the director of crew, and this is a few years ago, so maybe 2019, and 97% of men and like 78% of women admit to having used or looked at pornography. So it's prevalent. I mean, as a counselor, I ask almost every man that I work with at some point what their relationship is with it, because it's just free, it's accessible, it's anonymous, and it's affordable. It's available free in lots of places.
Yeah.
Are you seeing other types of addictions coming through? Historical addiction, even?
Yeah. So I think there is some substance abuse, and there is more alcoholism than is usually typically admitted. And so yeah. So people come to me because they find out that I am, somebody who was overseas and became an alcoholic, and they think, well, maybe this guy can help me. And then I find out that they and 5 of their friends all struggle. They're all overseas in particular contexts. And so that's not an untypical situation these days. And there's a variety of reasons why it's hidden the way it is, inside of relationships or inside of context. But it's pretty easy to be functional and be abusing alcohol. And so defining where that line is between addiction and abuse is sometimes pretty hard to do. So,
right.
Yeah, I would say that probably food, sexuality, and alcohol are the 3 biggest ones that I see, and the ones with the most impact on kind of embodying the gospel. Do I live well in the context of what I'm doing for the Lord? Do I live grace-filled and effectively? And the answer is no. If I'm not addressing these and they are running my life, then I'm living in a place of deep shame and not fulfilling my calling very well, and it's sad.
I wasn't surprised when you mentioned alcohol and sexual addictions, but I was surprised about food. And I mean, thinking about it, it makes sense because there are contexts where, if you're working in a majority Muslim context or something like that, where alcohol isn't readily available, then that would be an easier thing to go to. And, food and the taste of food really creates this sense of pleasure in us. And so I can see that, but it was also surprising.
But eating food releases dopamine. So we all have food that we enjoy. We could probably have 6 podcast episodes between the 3 of us just on the different types of food we like to create, to try, to go to.
Yeah.
So it's
exactly
natural occurring, one might say.
Exactly. And I have to eat. So
Right.
so it's a funny one to address. It's the only one that I have to do that can end up ruling my life. And so I've had a couple of different people, come to me with significant food disorders. And it's interesting to say, hey, I go into this ministry context. So I leave my home and I go into this cross-cultural experience for a few hours where I'm with people that I don't really understand their facial expressions. I'm not sure what they're trying to communicate to me. And I'm expending a lot of emotional and physical energy with the language. And then I go home and I've got my little jar of peanut butter that I'm hoarding. And it's, it's like, well, it's not the quantity of peanut butter. It's that internal posture the moment I put that spoon of peanut butter in my mouth. And so I've got this external behavior in response to an internal issue that is driving a budding addiction, And so the second one, which she was just telling me like how frequently she would go out right before the shops closed so that she could buy sweets in her context. And it was just this cyclical addictive response for her because it was so hard living where she was living as a single female missionary.
I worked with some guys this was a pretty common theme, particularly they were doing food programs in refugee camps in East Africa. And there were these 25, 26-year-olds who were at the top of the food chain. Like they were literally responsible for feeding 200,000 people. And the weight that carried, and it was hot and it was difficult. And it was so much pressure that when they were in that context, it was work until you're absolutely exhausted. And they would, hit up the duty free. They would do all of the things to get usually pretty hard liquor because they needed it to last. And it would just be go back to your room or your tent or wherever you're staying and drink until you're asleep and then do it again. And it was just this kind of survival thing, which developed quite a tolerance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's a behavior you more typically see in the military. And but the external pressures are significant enough that they kind of reflect each other. Yeah,
right.
That's powerful. Yeah.
Do you see addictions and addictive behavior different in men and women and how it's expressed?
Yes. So the majority of alcohol abusers that I've worked with have been men.
Mhm.
The
That's
majority of food abusers have been women.
having recently been well in the literature. It's yeah, very true. Both of those. Significant percentage of alcohol is men. And in my experience, when it comes especially to pornography or forms of sexual addiction, that's been men. That number is climbing towards even, at least globally statistically, but particularly in cross-cultural workers, I see it a lot more in men.
So I do think that for women, pornography usage is still very anathema and much more hidden. And for men, it's almost become acceptable that I'm a sexual struggler as long as I'm doing something to work on it. But for women, that's not true still. And so in terms of the system, so now we get to the system piece, the system of the sending agency and the sending church and how they respond to, a male sexual struggler versus a female sexual struggler can be pretty different. So yeah. So I've had more female sexual strugglers come through my little counseling practice recently and in the last couple of years, and it's just more prevalent than it used to be.
Is
Yeah.
it age specific? So millennials and younger, more common, or
Vast majority are millennials.
yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the
So
systems respond differently, whether it's male or female. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
yeah, and so that might not be like I get a different response when I'm candidating, but it certainly is. I get a different response with my supervisor. So what kind of a supervisor I have and how they respond to my sexual struggle is pretty different. So I had a gal that came through and she was just talking about her struggle in isolation and how that's led to some pornography usage and kind of almost compulsive masturbation. And she said her supervisor's response, the look on his face when she told her everything about what the plan was going to be, that she just it was not going to be well accepted.
Oh.
And so it was just very it just really shut her down. And I'm like, yeah, that's I understand that would happen, but that is so graceless.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, probably pot calling kettle black. I mean, the way at least is talked about mostly in the circles of men, masturbation, actively seeking it out, using all of that stuff, I feel like has become so much more normalized so that the shame is a little less intense. Whereas for women, it's still, very, very shameful, which makes in both situations, I think people generally less interested in seeking help.
Yeah,
That shame
it's really
component.
true. And so, one of the ways of thinking about this is from a bigger perspective, as you were mentioning at the beginning, James, is the system has to be resilient, not just me as a worker. So I can be working on being healthy and working on my well-being, but if my system is inherently unresilient, it's very rigid, then that's going to make it really problematic for me.
Right.
What kind of response am I going to get? What kind of help am I going to get?
Because if the
Yeah.
response is going to be rigid and the response is going to be, okay, you're leaving the field, or, well, this is going in your HR file right now, then you're not going to want to talk about it. My goodness.
Or everybody in the system's barely hanging on and using their own unhealthy coping strategies.
Yep.
Both cases aren't set up well to support the individual that's struggling.
It's really true. So resilience from are there resources, are there people who have some form of training, professional or otherwise, that can help me move forward and develop a soul care process. That's super important.
Are you often letting people know for the first time that they have a problem? Or has there been some identification?
That's an excellent question. So I would say only with alcohol have I had cross-cultural workers argue with me about abuse versus addiction. Yes, I'm aware I'm abusing this. I probably need to cut down. 6 drinks a night is probably too much, that sort of a thing. With others, no, they come to me and they're like, I'm well aware that sugar is my God, and I need to do something about it. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, so I think probably two men have wanted to argue with me about that, and it's all been around alcohol.
Right. The fact that you have to argue is probably an indicator enough that it's a problem.
You're trying to split hairs between
That's
abuse
right.
and addiction. Mm.
Well, and again, so we go back to that system piece. In one of those situations, I know that the organizational policy was, if it is addiction, then you're coming home. If it's not
Oh, right.
addiction, you can stay on the field. So the system itself is geared to deception.
Right. Our organization, I don't know if it's still there or practiced for a long time, was if anyone had a moral lapse, which would include looking at pornography, they were required to tell the supervisor that they have discovered this if somebody told them, which of course made it far less likely that somebody would reach out on purpose to get help. Not a
Yes.
great system plan.
No,
Nope.
not a bit.
Here, let me hand you the knife that you can stick in me.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Vern, do you feel like there's been a shift in sending organizations into how they might prepare cross-cultural workers even before they leave for the, eventuality that a large number of them are going to struggle with addictions, and like how to sort of build resilience or build into themselves like things that are going to help them?
Yeah. So the leading wave of this is certainly around pornography and unhealthy sexual practices. And so and in those areas, yes, more and more agencies are following they're going to other organizations that have already come up with a program and saying, show me your program, can we adopt it? And so typically it's like a sexual health and wholeness program or something along those lines. And they're very well professionally informed, as well as kind of soul care, biblical care, pieces to them. So yeah, I'm seeing, much more. Oh yeah, we started doing that about 6 years ago in our organization. Now that is the medium to larger orgs. We have 400, 500 personnel and bigger. The smaller than that orgs, this is, they don't have time for this. So they don't have the resources to create it. So they are externalizing it. What are our resources outside of the org that can help you? But the problem is that this is an area where integration is super helpful. So if it's my leaders in my org that are talking about, these are our steps for well-being around sexuality, and I'm doing it as a leader, that is a huge resilience piece for a cross-cultural worker. So I'm a part of a community. I'm not the aberration in the community.
I imagine like there is shame around the idea of addictions when in any community that we're thinking about, whether you're living in your home country context or whatever. But I feel like with cross-cultural workers, that sense of shame is just heightened because it feels like, we weren't spiritual enough or good enough to do this work without having to, rely on these addictions to help us get through. And I wonder if the people you work with sort of realize that shame component to it when you're talking to them.
Well, I mean, in my context, they do, because I say, hey, we're going to take a strategic approach that says, here's kind of a clinical piece, but this other piece is identity. And identity always has a shame piece. And so right off the bat, we start merging those two together to normalize, the struggle that they're having, and to help them to understand that I need to address this in my identity. I need to address God loves every part of me. God loves the alcoholic in me. I can't tell you how many times I've sat with the Lord and said, I need to hear from you what you think about me, the alcoholic, and receiving the love of the Lord in that moment.
Unconditional.
Recognizing my belovedness, unconditional belovedness. And so, yeah, so most of them, that's where I get the strongest emotional responses. Yes, I know I came to you for very professionally informed help, and we're going to develop a process that I can carry back to overseas work after this intensive is done. And that process is going to have some well-being pieces and, some other things in my system. But the big emotional response I get is, you are telling me I'm still beloved?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing has changed. And part of that is them sitting across from me and saying, well, I think Vern's a pretty cool guy and God still loves him. So maybe God can still love me. And it just begins to unplug shame. And so the mutuality of offered belovedness is just massive.
And it's so crucial because shame is such a big trigger for addiction. When you look at the cycle of addiction, a lot of times there's that craving, it builds, then there's the caving, then there's a ton of shame, and that shame is often a trigger. So we think halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, stressed. I had another S of shame. Huge trigger for then engaging again in that addictive behavior, that addictive substance, which is why a lot of the guys I work with binge. It's not a one-time thing. If they're struggling with sobriety and working on that, and then they do fall, that's usually that shame just leads to pretty substantial binging.
Yeah. And I would say that I could argue anecdotally that I see more of that among cross-cultural workers than I see the day in and day out functional alcoholic. I see more bingers, yeah,
right,
as an expression of addiction. Yeah.
I wonder if you see people who are really able and willing to engage in the cognitive work of like, okay, what steps do I need to take? What safeguards do I need to have in place? But sitting with their shame and learning to sit in their belovedness sounds like really hard work.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is. And, we all know that the anti-beloved voice that goes on inside of my soul, inside of my mind is just there quietly repeating itself, like one of those old LPs where the needle gets stuck in the middle and it just play.
Yeah.
And so inviting people to turn that off, to be in the process of turning that voice off, to repenting of believing that what that voice says is true, to getting specific details about their belovedness and living from those places. God loves all of who I am, from the color of my hair to my personality type, to the length of my fingers, to my sexuality, to my yearnings, the unmet yearnings. Some of them will be met in this life, most of them will not. That's just humanity. And God loves all that about me, not the acceptable parts only, but also the unacceptable parts. Yeah.
And part of that's because our will is just not enough on its own. This is Dallas Willard, and it's actually in the book Boundaries, but they talk about if the will was strong enough, the Bible would have ended at Exodus 20, but it didn't. So,
Exactly.
There's more to it than that.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
So I said to somebody recently when they were like, so what do you actually do in addiction therapy? I said, I feed the heart. You feed the heart. If you don't feed the heart in care, then people don't grow long-term. Things don't change. So in the addiction model, when I hit the craving phase, the job is not to boundary my behavior. The job is to feed my soul, to get out of isolation into connected relationship, to be anchored in the things that make me healthy. And so,
do you see treatment being different for cross-cultural workers as compared to people living in their home context?
Yeah. So do I see, the treatment plan being a little different? I certainly do, because the factors that cause an elevated struggle, that feed the addictive pattern, are greater. So we have to address isolation and connected relationships at a higher level than we would in somebody living in their home culture. That's just reality. So your plan for well-being in terms of how often you see people that let you authentically be you, that let you stay grounded, is very important. And so let's just say I'm working with a couple that are generally kind of on their own with one other couple out in the bush of Africa. And then I will be more prone to say to them, I need you to schedule when you're going to get out of that context and be with people that love you, at a retreat center there in your country, another country, whatever it takes. This is the pattern of well-being for your life. And we're going to put it on paper, and you're going to plan for it, and your supervisor is going to agree to it. And we're doing that. And it's a massive preventative measure. So isolation is one. The second is just how frequently they have to use self-evaluative questions. So in a stateside context, we might say, hey, you have to develop questions where you're checking in with yourself in maintenance mode. And you need to at least do that weekly. You got to at least weekly, be looking at your questions. How did the last week go? With cross-cultural workers, I say it's every other day. So you spend some time with the Lord, you pull out your journal, you ask yourself the 3 or 4 questions that you've crafted that are about your well-being. You determine if you're living in the green, or if you're feeling kind of yellow, you're feeling tempted, and you make a decision. And because you can't go much more than about 48 hours and successfully have a successful response to the current cravings.
When we're thinking about treatment, which is what you're talking about, loneliness is got to be one of the most common things I see across the board, right? People are just really, really lonely. And I think there's some of that true, at least in American culture, but I've only kind of been back for such short stints. I don't have a great perspective of it. But certainly with the cross-cultural workers I'm with, there's just a prevalent, deep, and significant loneliness.
Yeah, I would really confirm that. Yeah.
Which huge trigger, right? And that's what you're talking about. You got to feed that need, and it the best food is connection. So how are they supposed to do that, Vern?
Yeah. Yeah. So, what do you do about isolation? I think my first response to that is to the agency, and that is, why are you still sending people out solo as if that is a godly concept? Because, since the 90s, we've said, man, we need to be teaming and we need to allow teams to form in ways that are effective relationally. So certainly missionally is important, but we can agree on some missional applications. If we don't have relationship, then we're in trouble all the time. And honestly, it's not just my team, but it's also my supervisor and how they relate to me that generates resiliency and strength. And it's okay for me to be me in this context. Goofy, karaoke loving Vern can be a missionary. It's okay.
Yeah.
But
what about the situations where perhaps your teammates might be contributing to the stress and contributing to the triggers for you?
Yeah. So I've literally had to help folks set up a process of kind of how are we going to have a conversation about the way that we are relating to one another. And then if that doesn't go well, what are my next steps? And so two of the people that I've worked with that have addictions, they've concluded the same thing I've concluded. I cannot be in conflict long-term with people and work with them daily. So either they're going to change or I'm going to go find somewhere else to be.
Right.
So the question is, how long? How long can I put up with it? So the only relapse I've had since sobriety has been around conflict with another missionary. And I let it go on too long, and it's my own fault.
It just ate you
and
up.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And so my counselor said, when I went back into counseling, he said, that was the slowest relapse I've ever heard of. you just stayed in that space, in conflict with this person. And and it was unhealthy. So developing a mindset that if I want to stay on the field serving the Lord, there's some things that are criteria, and they are in my evaluative process. They're in my system. And, I won't be in conflict for longer than bump, bump, bump is one of those evaluative questions.
One of the things I help people think through when it comes especially to loneliness, isolation, and connection as a potential cure, as opposed to being involved in addiction, is that they probably won't be able to get all the relational needs met from one person or two people, because that doesn't exist in their context, in their time zone, in a language that they best understand. So if that's the case, how then do you sparse that out in enough different types of relationships? Perhaps some local relationships are really meaningful, perhaps not to 100%. Then do you have some people that you can challenge in your home context and say, actually, I really need you, and I need you consistently and regularly? And then is there some people that you can have in a mentorship relationship? So there's somebody with some form of like ability to speak into your life, whether that's authority or mentoring or coaching, that they can actually say something and you listen, because that's kind of the key part of that. Is there a way to begin bridging some of those? Because I think we want ultimately really deep, meaningful relationships with a few people. And sometimes cross-culturally, that's just really hard to do.
Yeah.
Because they leave
and
or
so
I
again,
leave or.
Yeah, the complexity of that is interesting, because if my sending church is such that I can't tell them my struggles, then do I choose somebody from my sending church to be the person I'm just connected to as a peer and I share my story with? Am I always living in fear of exposure as a result? My hope would be, and if I could go to sending churches, this is what I would say to them: who is the one person that can be a spiritual friend to your missionary? They just come alongside, listen, share, reaffirm their belovedness.
They're not prone
and they
to
initiate.
they're not prone to pearl clutching and gasping.
Yeah. And I need them more than I need answers. I need connection more than I need, lightning bolts of understanding.
Right.
It's so you realize, oh, are we talking about attachment as well? Yes, we definitely are. So
Yeah.
adult attachment models, if you got into that discussion, they would say cross-cultural workers are violating adult attachment models right and left. So
Yes.
how in the world they expect to be healthy, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blowing up attachments like crazy.
Yeah. So to answer your question, James, yeah. So sending church, is there one person that could be a spiritual friend? That's good. Does the organization have mentors of people that are older and have been through the experiences and also don't have reporting requirements? They're not gonna tattletale. They're going to engage with my belovedness and my shame. Then that's good. Those could be some of the best money spent keeping a cross-cultural worker on the field.
Absolutely. We just had Jeff Whiteman on, and he was talking about how we've been kind of doing staff care wrong in just trying to prevent attrition. And really what we need to do is be trying to have healthy people. That's the better like aim and direction. Same thing as we talk about addiction. Like it's two parts. One is we really want to help people have really strong, meaningful connectedness, knownness, belovedness in their identity and in how they relate to other people as a primary way of working, as opposed to just trying to stop addictive behaviors, like trying to just rule out all of pornography usage. That abstinence is a good thing, but really our energy and focus needs to be over here at helping, move towards connectedness and helping people feel grounded and supported and their needs are being met in healthy ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really love Jeff. I mean, he is a brilliant researcher. And it was 3 years ago when I was wrestling with, hey, there's something wrong with the system, that I heard Jeff say, the system is aimed in the wrong direction. It's aimed at attrition when it needs to be aimed at well-being. And I was like, mind blown, and I thought that's exactly what I'm perceiving. And this affects everything. So addiction is a well-being issue, first and foremost. So therefore it needs to, addiction, any kind of a care piece that does not have soul care embedded in it is professionally informed and then very inadequate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the most helpful model of addiction is biopsychosocial spiritual.
Yes.
I may have left one out there, but all of us.
Your whole being. Yeah.
The thing I love about that is, okay, so now as a clinical provider working with cross-cultural workers, I've got each of those tools, sets of tools that fit those areas in my bag, and I can craft something unique for this person, because South Korea is not Africa. So I need the ability, so the other part of the resilient system is, are the care providers aware of what these real needs are? And people say to me, your success rate is high. Why is it high? Because I understand that clinical care is 2 slices of the pizza pie. And that soul care and spiritual friendship and a general perspective on self-care is the rest of it. I've got to be there.
Vern, if there's someone listening to this who is struggling with an addiction but hasn't really talked to anyone yet, what would you like for them to know, and what would you like for them to get from this?
Yeah.
Or even abuse and not an addiction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the first thing I would say to them is, if I was with them face to face, is I'd probably put my hands on their shoulders and say, welcome to the club. You're normal. These yearnings are legitimate. They're the way God designed you. And not only is there hope, there are tried and true spaces in which you can begin to pursue healing, but you have to be willing to go on the journey. The hardest part is commitment to the journey, because it's going to take me a while, because I'm a unique, eternal creature, and nobody can offer me a universal plan that's going to fit me. I have to figure out, with help from others, what the particular pieces are that are going to help me to walk. So be committed to the journey, recognize that you're normal, and welcome to the club.
Can't do it alone.
Yeah.
Or you would have.
You've touched on some things that you would like for sending organizations and churches to know, or maybe do a little bit differently. And I wonder if there's anything else that you've thought of that you'd like to see change.
Well, I think, it's becoming more and more obvious that actual spiritual formation from sending churches is not happening effectively with the younger missionaries that are going out. And so I would like sending churches to know that a much more robust formative piece needs to be in place, which includes the kind of care and counseling that lets them address some family of origin pieces, lets them become aware of their God-given design, that this is the way God has made me. And I don't care, what tools you use to do that, whether, it's MBTI or Enneagram or, whatever, but I have to functionally go down the road of preparing for the field by knowing who I am in Christ, and I have rhythms. I have rhythms of care. I have rhythms of well-being that I am wrestling with. How do I transfer these over to the cross-cultural context? And so when I have a female missionary in her 50s look at me and say, I haven't gardened in 30 years. Gardening is one of the languages of my soul. And I'm thinking to myself, what are you doing? So you're about to move. Get a house with a garden. Care for your soul. And she did. And her husband's like, man, she's so much happier. And I'm like, well, I have no clue why that is. I can't tell you. It's probably the Bible study you're doing right now. I'm just okay. Sorry.
That's the garden.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I'm just a little post-evangelical, let's just say.
Same.
And then descending agencies, I would say the similar thing. So if what we do through candidacy is identify what the needs are, but we don't effectively train to those needs so that we can then integrate processes while they're on the field, then what I'm trying to integrate is something that has not been well trained in me. So the whole, you become a candidate and then you go and raise funds. And when you're done raising funds, you have 45 days to get on the field. Wait, hold on. Why so quick? What is that about? Now that I'm funded, pause, prepare to go to war. And that just doesn't happen well in most sending agencies. There used to be this agency called International Teams, and they've become something else whose name I can't remember right now, but they would put people in homes in a community stateside and say, form your team, spend some months forming your team. And then they would go overseas as a team. And I thought, why in the world is every sending agency not doing that? But that's the kind of, sending org, let's prepare for resiliency, let's prepare for well-being kind of stuff, I'd say.
Any other just resources, things you can point people to that would be helpful, particularly as it relates to addiction?
Yeah, I mean, a smart recovery is uniquely helpful for cross-cultural workers because it has an online piece. So any cross-cultural worker can jump online into a chat room, working on any aspect, motivation, the cognitive behavioral truth piece, doing their ABC tools, the different things that they may have started with their counselor in the States, or if they're really lucky, if they've got a Vallejo counselor who can work with them, then they can also do pieces during the week and month, through that online platform. So that's probably, one of them. The other thing I would say is I do like intensives for people that struggle with addiction. And those intensives can be a little bit longer or a little bit more spaced out because of the needs. But getting a well-informed, cross-culturally informed counselor who has the kind of addiction piece as well would be my dream for everybody that needs help right now. Face-to-face is always best.
Yeah, I agree. Wow.
Thanks so much.
Great.
Yeah.
Been super fun. This time flew by. Vern, it's good to
Yeah.
see you again.
Good to see you guys.
Vern.
Thanks for letting me be on and
share
my highly opinionated thoughts that I think everybody should have access to.
Thanks for sharing some of your story too. Appreciate you being
really
vulnerable.
appreciate that, Vern.
It's my privilege. Love to see you guys out in Colorado sometime. And if you need a few days just to recover, MTI has a campus and we'd love to host you for free. Fun. Thank you.
All right. Great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Vern. Brandy's frozen.
Sorry, I just dropped my earbud. I've got big Welsh ears and they don't hold the earbuds.
I have a pretty good vest game, I must say.
James and I have worked together for how many years now, James? Have you been?
Long enough.